So we should add fetch tasks as a dependency here to use effect, because you learned that basically every piece of data or function which is set up inside of a component function which you are using in use effect should be added as a dependency. The problem with that, and therefore you shouldn't save this file yet, is that this would create an infinite loop. Why? Because we will call fetch tasks here, and this will then go ahead and execute this send request function in the custom hook, and that will then set some states. When the states are set, the component where we use the custom hook will be re-rendered. Because I explained that when you use a custom hook, which uses state, and you use that hook in a component, that component will implicitly use that state set up in the custom hook. So the state configured in the custom hook is attached to the component where you use the custom hook. So if we call set is loading and set error here in the send request function in the custom hook, this will trigger the app component to be re-evaluated because I'm using that custom hook here in that component. Now that, however, will then call the custom hook again when that component is re-evaluated. And when that custom hook is called again, I am indeed recreating the send request function, and I'm returning a new function object, and therefore use effect will run again. And that happens because, as I explained earlier in the course, in the behind the scenes module, functions are objects in JavaScript, and every time a function is recreated, even if it contains the same logic, it's a brand new object in memory. And therefore use effect would treat it as a new value, even if it's technically the same function, and it would re-execute it. So, to avoid this, we should go to use HTTP and wrap send request with use callback, which we can do also when we use async await in there. This is no problem. So we import use callback and then wrap this function here with use callback. Now use callback also needs a dependency array though, and this dependency array also should list everything which is being used in here. And in my case, that is, for example, that request config object, but also this apply data function which we're calling. Now, this poses yet another problem though. Since that is the case, we should add request config and apply data as dependencies here. But of course, both, again, are objects. Request config is a standard JavaScript object. Apply data is a function, which you learned also is an object. So back in the app component, where we're passing in this object and this function, we again have to ensure that these objects are not recreated all the time when this function runs again, which they currently would be. So here in app component, we also should import use callback and wrap transform tasks here with use callback, for example, and add our dependency array here. And here we don't have to add anything because in here I'm not using anything external other than set tasks, which is a state updating function. And as explained multiple times in the course, these are guaranteed to never change. And if this is looking cumbersome, yeah, it can be tricky to get into. It might look like a lot of work, but it is something you're getting used to over time, and it is very logical in the end. It is simply related to how JavaScript works after all. Now with that, we're guaranteeing that transform tasks will not change all the time, but this object here will. We are recreating it here all the time whenever the app component is re-evaluated. So to work around that, we could look into use memo or anything like that to ensure that this object doesn't change all the time, or we change our custom hook again. Instead of accepting the request config here in the hook itself, why don't we expect it here in the send request function? After all, that is the function which is being called with that config. So we could expect this request config object not here in use HTTP, but here in send request. So here. Then we don't need to add it as a dependency here, because it's now a parameter of this wrapped function, not an external dependency. And therefore we got rid of this issue, and in app component all we gotta do is take this object with the URL and remove it here, so that transform tasks is the only function we're passing to use HTTP. And we then go to fetch tasks, where we are sending the request in the end. Keep in mind that fetch tasks is just send requests because of this aliasing here. And we pass our config object here. That's something we could do. And of course, we could do something similar with the data transformation function. If using use callback here in app component is too cumbersome for you, if you don't like this approach, we can get rid of that and instead just pass transform tasks as a second argument to fetch tasks here and not to use HTTP, so that we call use HTTP without any arguments. And we actually create transform tasks. Whoops, get rid of the dependencies here. We create transform tasks like this inside of the effect. Then this also is no external dependency in the effect. And now we make sure that use HTTP, our custom hook, can be called without any dependencies or without any parameters, because we're passing the request-specific configuration and the data transformation that should be applied after the request was sent directly to the request. And I showed both alternatives because both would be viable ways of doing it, and I also wanted to show you what the potential downfalls or disadvantages of the other approach are. Now, of course, we need to go to use HTTP and not expect apply data here as a parameter of the custom hook, but instead here for send request. And with that, of course, use callback here in our custom hook has no dependencies anymore, because all the data it's operating on is received as parameters in the wrapped functions. We got no external dependencies here. And with all of that, if we go back to app.js, we now have code that should run without an infinite loop and without any issues. If we now go back and reload, the tasks are still being fetched. And again, I'm fully aware of the fact that this can be confusing. I hope I could still explain why the different steps were needed. Of course, I could have shown you that final solution right from the start, but it is super important to understand that there are different ways of achieving this, and the other solution wasn't bad or wrong. This is just a solution which minimizes the number of dependencies, makes this a bit easier to manage, but the other solution would have been fine as well. And most importantly, I wanted to make it clear why we derived this solution now and why I'm going with this solution now. With all of that though, the hook is looking good and app.js works, but of course the main reason for adding the hook in the first place was to reuse logic across components. And here in the app component we're fine now, but we still got our new task component, where we also are sending a request. So let's use our custom hook there as a next step.